please begin reading the next chapter at the top of page 93 in your book.
Pressed up against the others in an effort to keep out the cold, head empty and heavy at the same time, brain a whirlpool of decaying memories, indifference deadened my spirit. Here or elsewhere, what difference did it make? To die today or tomorrow or later, the night was long and never-ending. When at last a gray glimmer of light appeared on the horizon, it revealed a tangle of human shapes, heads sunk upon shoulders, crouched, piled one on top of the other, like a field of dust-covered tombstones in the first light of the dawn. I tried to distinguish those who were still alive from those who had gone, but there was no difference. My gaze was held for a long time by one who lay with his eyes open, staring into the void. His livid face was covered with a layer of frost and snow. My father was huddled near me, wrapped in his blanket, his shoulders covered with snow. And was he dead too? I called him. No answer. I would have cried out if I could have done so. He did not move. My mind was invaded suddenly by this realization. There was no more reason to live, no more reason to struggle. The train stopped in the middle of a deserted field. The suddenness of the halt woke some of those who were asleep. They straightened themselves up, throwing startled looks around them. Outside, the SS went by, shouting, "Throw out all the dead! All corpses outside!" The living rejoiced. There would be more room. Volunteers set to work. They felt those who were still crouching. "Here's one. Take him!" They undressed him, the survivors avidly sharing out his clothes. Then 2 grave diggers took him, one by the head and one by the feet, and threw him out of the wagon like a sack of flour. From all directions came cries. "Come on, here's one! The man next to me, he doesn't move!" I woke from my apathy just at the moment when 2 men came up to my father. I threw myself on top of his body. He was cold. I slapped him. I rubbed his hands, crying, "Father! Father, wake up! They're trying to throw you out of the carriage!" His body remained inert. The 2 gravediggers seized me by the collar. "Leave him! You can see perfectly well that he's dead!" "No!" I cried. "He isn't dead! Not yet!" I set to work to slap him as hard as I could. After a moment, my father's eyelids moved slightly over his glazed eyes. He was breathing weakly. "You see?" I cried. The 2 men moved away. 20 bodies were thrown out of our wagon. Then the train resumed its journey, leaving behind it a few hundred naked dead, deprived of burial in the deep snow of a field in Poland. We were given no food. We lived on snow. It took the place of bread. The days were like nights, and the nights left the dregs of their darkness in our souls. The train was traveling slowly, often stopping for several hours and then setting off again. It never ceased snowing. All through these days and nights we stayed crouching, one on top of the other, never speaking a word. We were no more than frozen bodies. Our eyes closed. We waited merely for the next stop so that we could unload our dead. 10 days, 10 nights of traveling. Sometimes we would pass through German townships. Very early in the morning, usually. The workmen were going to work. They stopped and stared after us, but otherwise showed no surprise. One day when we had stopped, a workman took a piece of bread out of his bag and threw it into a wagon. There was a stampede. Dozens of starving men fought each other to the death for a few crumbs. The German workmen took a lively interest in this spectacle.
This chapter begins with a horrible scene. For 10 days and nights, the prisoners are piled on top of each other in a train with no food, no water, and no roof to protect them from the cold and snow. Sometimes the SS soldiers stop the train and order the prisoners to toss out the bodies of passengers who have died. Naked corpses lie in heaps on the Polish fields. Elie's sleeping father is almost taken for dead and tossed onto one of the piles until Elie frantically slaps him awake. One day, A German worker tosses a piece of bread into one of the train cars, and he and his fellow workers have fun watching the starving prisoners fight each other for it. It's easy to understand why the prisoners are attacking each other. After 10 days without food, just about anyone would be willing to fight like an animal for some bread. What is not so easy to understand is how the workers could be entertained by this scene. Clearly, they are the real animals. Or maybe not. Perhaps it takes a human being to think up something so cruel and horrible. This book has certainly shown us the very worst parts of human nature and the way that people treat each other. Let's continue on page 95 with Some Years Later.
Some years later, I watched the same kind of scene at Aden. The passengers on our boat were amusing themselves by throwing coins to the natives who were diving in to get them. An attractive, aristocratic Parisienne was deriving special pleasure from the game. I suddenly noticed that 2 children were engaged in a death struggle, trying to strangle each other. I turned to the lady. "Please," I begged, "don't throw any more money in." "Why not?" she said. "I like to give charity." In the wagon where the bread had fallen, a real battle had broken out. Men threw themselves on top of each other, stamping on each other, tearing at each other, biting each other. Wild beasts of prey with animal hatred in their eyes. An extraordinary vitality had seized them, sharpening their teeth and nails. A crowd of workmen and curious spectators had collected along the train. They had probably never seen a train with such cargo. Soon, nearly everywhere, pieces of bread were being dropped into the wagons. The audience stared at these skeletons of men fighting one another to the death for a mouthful. A piece fell into our wagon. I decided that I would not move. Anyway, I knew I would never have the strength to fight with a dozen savage men. Not far away, I noticed an old man dragging himself along on all fours. He was trying to disengage himself from the struggle. He held one hand to his heart. I thought at first he had received a blow in the chest. Then I understood. He had a bit of bread under his shirt. With remarkable speed, he drew it out and put it to his mouth. His eyes gleamed. A smile like a grimace lit up his dead face and was immediately extinguished. A shadow had just loomed up near him. The shadow threw itself upon him, fell to the ground, stunned with blows. The old man cried, "Meir, Meir, my boy, don't you recognize me? I'm your father. You're hurting me. You're killing your father. I've got some bread for you too. For you too." He collapsed. His fist was still clenched around a small piece. He tried to carry it to his mouth, but the other one threw himself upon him and snatched it. The old man again whispered something, let out a rattle, and died amid the general indifference. His son searched him, took the bread, and began to devour it. He was not able to get very far. 2 men had seen and hurled themselves upon him. Others joined in. When they withdrew, next to me were 2 corpses, side by side, the father and the son. I was 15 years old. In our wagon there was a friend of my father's called Meir Katz. He had worked as a gardener at Buna and used to bring us a few green vegetables occasionally. Being less undernourished than the rest of us, he had stood up to the imprisonment better. Because he was relatively more vigorous, he had been put in charge of the wagon. On the 3rd night of our journey, I woke up suddenly and felt 2 hands on my throat trying to strangle me. I just had time to shout, "Father!" Nothing but this word. I felt myself suffocating, but my father had woken up and seized my attacker. Too weak to overcome him, he had the idea of calling Meir Katz. "Come here! Come quickly! There's someone strangling my son!" A few moments later, I was free. I still do not know why the man wanted to strangle me. After a few days, Meir Katz spoke to my father. "Shlomo, I'm getting weak. I'm losing my strength. I can't hold on." "Don't let yourself go under," my father said, trying to encourage him. "You must resist. Don't lose faith in yourself." But Mayor Kotz groaned heavily in reply. I can't go on any longer, Shlomo. What can I do? I can't carry on. My father took his arm, and Mayor Kotz, the strong man, the most robust of us all, wept. His son had been taken from him at the time of the first selection, but it was now that he wept. It was now that he cracked up. He was finished, at the end of his tether. On the last day of our journey, a terrible wind arose. It snowed without ceasing. We felt that the end was near, the real end. We could never hold out in this icy wind, in these gusts. Someone got up and shouted, "We mustn't stay sitting down at a time like this. We shall freeze to death. Let's all get up and move a bit." We all got up. We held our damp blankets more tightly around us, and we forced ourselves to move a few steps to turn around where we were. Suddenly, a cry rose up from the wagon, the cry of a wounded animal. Someone had just died. Others, feeling that they too were about to die, imitated his cry, and their cry seemed to come from beyond the grave. Soon everyone was crying out, wailing, groaning, cries of distress hurled into the wind and the snow. The contagion spread to other carriages. Hundreds of cries rose up simultaneously, not knowing against whom we cried, not knowing why. The death rattle of a whole convoy who felt the end upon them. We were all going to die here. All limits had been passed. No one had any strength left, and again the night would be long. Mayor Kotz groaned. Why don't they shoot us all right away? The same evening, we reached our destination. It was late at night. The guards came to unload us. The dead were abandoned in the train. Only those who could still stand were able to get out. Mayor Kotz stayed in the train. The last day had been the most murderous. 100 of us had got into the wagon. 12 of us got out. Among them, my father and I. We had arrived at Buchenwald.
The train has arrived at Buchenwald, a death camp in Germany. Only 12 out of the 100 men have survived the trip, and amazingly, Elie and his father are among them. Many horrifying things have happened in this book, but those final days on the train were among the worst Elie has spent. He's seen dead bodies dumped in the fields, never to get a proper burial. He's watched ordinary German people laugh and cheer as the prisoners fought each other for crumbs of food. And he's looked on as a son tried to kill his own father for a scrap of bread. Now, as the train pulls into Buchenwald, the remaining passengers are howling like animals and screaming like madmen. The suffering has finally become too much for them to take. It's horrible that so many passengers have died, but a miracle that even 12 have made it this far. Can things get even worse? How many of these men will ever see freedom? Let's begin the next chapter on page 99.
At the gate of the camp, SS officers were waiting for us. They counted us. Then we were directed to the assembly place. Orders were given to us through loudspeakers. Form fives. Form groups of 100. 5 paces forward. I held on to my father's hand, the old familiar fear not to lose him. Right next to us, the high chimney of the crematory oven rose up. It no longer made any impression on us. It scarcely attracted our attention. An established inmate of Buchenwald told us that we should have a shower and then we could go into the blocks. The idea of having a hot bath fascinated me. My father was silent. He was breathing heavily beside me. "Father," I said, "only another moment more. Soon we can lie down in a bed. You can rest." He did not answer. I was so exhausted myself that his silence left me indifferent. My only wish was to take a bath as quickly as possible and lie down in a bed. But it was not easy to reach the showers. Hundreds of prisoners were crowding there. The guards were unable to keep any order. They struck out right and left with no apparent result. Others, without the strength to push or even to stand up, had sat down in the snow. My father wanted to do the same. He groaned. "I can't go on. This is the end. I'm going to die here." He dragged me toward a hillock of snow from which emerged human shapes and ragged pieces of blanket. "Leave me," he said to me. "I can't go on. Have mercy on me. I'll wait here until we can get into the baths. You can come and find me." I could have wept with rage. Having lived through so much, suffered so much, could I leave my father to die now when we could have a good hot bath and lie down? "Father!" I screamed. "Father, get up from here, immediately! You're killing yourself!" I seized him by the arm. He continued to groan. "Don't shout, son. Take pity on your old father. Leave me to rest here, just for a bit. I'm so tired, at the end of my strength." He had become like a child, weak, timid, vulnerable. "Father," I said, "you can't stay here." I showed him the corpses all round him. They too had wanted to rest here. "I can see them, son. I can see them all right. Let them sleep. It's so long since they closed their eyes. They are exhausted. Exhausted." His voice was tender. I yelled against the wind. "They'll never wake again! Never! Don't you understand?" For a long time this argument went on. I felt that I was not arguing with him, but with death itself, with the death that he had already chosen. The sirens began to wail. An alert. The lights went out throughout the camp. The guards drove us toward the blocks. In a flash, there was no one left on the assembly place. We were only too glad not to have had to stay outside longer in the icy wind. We let ourselves sink down onto the planks. The beds were in several tiers. The cauldrons of soup at the entrance attracted no one. To sleep, that was all that mattered. It was daytime when I awoke, and then I remembered that I had a father. Since the alert, I had followed the crowd without troubling about him. I had known that he was at the end, on the brink of death, and yet I had abandoned him. I went to look for him, but at the same moment this thought came into my mind: don't let me find him. If only I could get rid of this dead weight so that I could use all my strength to struggle for my own survival and worry only about myself. Immediately I felt ashamed of myself, ashamed forever. I walked for hours without finding him. Then I came back to the block where they were giving out black coffee. The men were lining up and fighting. A plaintive, beseeching voice caught me in the spine. "Eliezer, my son, bring me a drop of coffee." I ran to him. "Father, I've been looking for you for so long. Where were you? Did you sleep? How do you feel?" He was burning with fever. Like a wild beast, I cleared away from myself to the coffee cauldron, and I managed to carry back a cupful. I had a sip. The rest was for him. I can't forget the light of thankfulness in his eyes while he gulped it down, an animal gratitude. With those few gulps of hot water, I probably brought him more satisfaction than I had done during my whole childhood. He was lying on a plank, livid, his lips pale and dried up, shaken by tremors. I could not stay by him for long. Orders had been given to clear the place for cleaning. Only the sick could stay. We stayed outside for 5 hours. Soup was given out. As soon as we were allowed to go back to the blocks, I ran to my father. "Have you had anything to eat?" "No." "Why not?" "They didn't give us anything. They said that if we were ill, we should die soon anyway, and it would be a pity to waste the food. I can't go on any more." I gave him what was left of my soup. but it was with a heavy heart. I felt that I was giving it up to him against my will. No better than Rabbi Eliyahu's son had I withstood the test. He grew weaker day by day, his gaze veiled, his face the color of dead leaves. On the third day after our arrival at Buchenwald, everyone had to go to the showers, even the sick who had to go through last. On the way back from the baths, we had to wait outside for a long time. They had not yet finished cleaning the blocks. Seeing my father in the distance, I ran to meet him. He went by me like a ghost, passed me without stopping, without looking at me. I called to him. He did not come back. I ran after him. "Father, where are you running to?" He looked at me for a moment, and his gaze was distant, visionary. It was the face of someone else. A moment only, and on he ran again.
Here in Buchenwald, Elie barely notices the crematory ovens that once would have terrified him. All he cares about is sleeping and eating, and for the first time, he wishes he did not have to take care of his dying father so he could have more soup for himself. Elie feels he's no better than Rabbi Eliyahu's son, the boy who let his father die because he didn't want the burden of caring for him any longer. But I don't think Elie is really like the rabbi's son. He feels ashamed and guilty for even thinking about abandoning his father, and in the end, he brings his father soup and takes care of him just like always. Elie's father has been behaving strangely. To Elie, it looks as though he is having visions and is not himself. I think this is a sign that more and more, Elie's father is slipping away from this world and moving toward the world of the dead. Let's continue on page 102 with Struck Down.
Struck down with dysentery, my father lay in his bunk, 5 other invalids with him. I sat by his side watching him, not daring to believe that he could escape death again. Nevertheless, I did all I could to give him hope. Suddenly, he raised himself on his bunk and put his feverish lips to my ear. "Eliezer, I must tell you where to find the gold and the money I buried in the cellar. You know." He began to talk faster and faster, as though he were afraid he would not have time to tell me. I tried to explain to him that this was not the end, that we would go back to the house together, but he would not listen to me. He could no longer listen to me. He was exhausted. A trickle of saliva, mingled with blood, was running from between his lips. He had closed his eyes. His breath was coming in gasps. For a ration of bread, I managed to change beds with a prisoner in my father's bunk. In the afternoon, the doctor came. I went and told him that my father was very ill. "Bring him here." I explained that he could not stand up, but the doctor refused to listen to anything. Somehow I brought my father to him. He stared at him, then questioned him in a clipped voice. "What do you want?" "My father's ill," I answered for him. "Dysentery." "Dysentery? That's not my business. I'm a surgeon. Go on, make room for the others." Protests did no good. "I can't go on, son. Take me back to my bunk." I took him back and helped him to lie down. He was shivering. "Try and sleep a bit, Father. Try to go to sleep." His breathing was labored, thick. He kept his eyes shut. Yet I was convinced that he could see everything, that now he could see the truth in all things. Another doctor came to the block, but my father would not get up. He knew that it was useless. Besides, this doctor had only come to finish off the sick. I could hear him shouting at them that they were lazy and just wanted to stay in bed. I felt like leaping at his throat, strangling him, but I no longer had the courage or the strength. I was riveted to my father's deathbed. My hands hurt. I was clenching them so hard. Oh, to strangle the doctor and the others, to burn the whole world, my father's murderers. But the cry stayed in my throat. When I came back from the bread distribution, I found my father weeping like a child. "Son, They keep hitting me. Who? I thought he was delirious. Him. The Frenchman. And the Pole. They were hitting me. Another wound to the heart, another hate, another reason for living lost. Eliezer, tell them not to hit me. I haven't done anything. Why do they keep hitting me? I began to abuse his neighbors. They laughed at me. I promised them bread, soup. They laughed. Then they got angry. They could not stand my father any longer, they said, because he was now unable to drag himself outside to relieve himself. Following day, he complained that they had taken his ration of bread. While you were asleep? No, I wasn't asleep. They jumped on top of me. They snatched my bread. And they hit me. Again. I can't stand any more, son. A drop of water? I knew that he must not drink, but he pleaded with me for so long that I gave in. Water was the worst poison he could have, but what else could I do for him? With water, without water, it would all be over soon anyway. You, at least, have some mercy on me. Have mercy on him, I, his only son. A week went by like this. This is your father, isn't it? Asked the head of the block. Yes. He's very ill. The doctor won't do anything for him. The doctor can't do anything for him now, and neither can you. He put his great hairy hand on my shoulder and added, Listen to me, boy. Don't forget that you're in a concentration camp. Here, every man has to fight for himself and not think of anyone else, even of his father. Here there are no fathers, no brothers, no friends. Everyone lives and dies for himself alone. I'll give you a sound piece of advice. Don't give your ration of bread and soup to your old father. There's nothing you can do for him. And you're killing yourself. Instead, you ought to be having his ration. I listened to him without interrupting. He was right, I thought, in the most secret region of my heart, but I dared not admit it. It's too late to save your old father, I said to myself. You ought to be having 2 rations of bread, 2 rations of soup. Only a fraction of a second, but I felt guilty. I ran to find a little soup to give to my father, but he did not want it. All he wanted was water. Don't drink water. Have some soup. I'm burning. Why are you being so unkind to me, my son? Some water. I brought him some water. Then I left the block for roll call, but I turned round and came back again. I lay down on the top bunk. Invalids were allowed to stay in the block, so I would be an invalid myself. I would not leave my father. There was silence all round now, broken only by groans. In the front of the block, the SS were giving orders. An officer passed by the beds. My father begged me, My son, some water. I'm burning. My stomach. Quiet over there, yelled the officer. Eliezer, went on my father. Some water. The officer came up to him and shouted at him to be quiet. But my father did not hear him. He went on calling me. The officer dealt him a violent blow on the head with his truncheon. I did not move. I was afraid. My body was afraid of also receiving a blow. Then my father made a rattling noise, and it was my name. Eliezer. I could see that he was still breathing, spasmodically. I did not move. When I got down after roll call, I could see his lips trembling as he murmured something. Bending over him, I stayed gazing at him for over an hour, engraving into myself the picture of his blood-stained face, his shattered skull. Then I had to go to bed. I climbed into my bunk above my father, who was still alive. It was January 28, 1945. I awoke on January 29 at dawn. In my father's place lay another invalid. They must have taken him away before dawn and carried him to the crematory. He may still have been breathing. There were no prayers at his grave. No candles were lit to his memory. His last word was my name, a summons to which I did not respond. I did not weep, and it pained me that I could not weep, but I had no more tears. And in the depths of my being, in the recesses of my weakened conscience, could I have searched it, I might perhaps have found something like free at last.
Now, Elie has experienced the worst pain that could happen to him in the camps, the death of his father. Even at the end, Elie's father suffers not only from hunger and sickness, but from the cruelty of others. The doctors don't care about him. The prisoners steal his food because they know he can't fight back, and an SS officer brutally crushes his skull. The last image Elie will ever have of his father is of a man covered with blood and gasping for air. The next morning his father is gone, taken to the ovens before Elie could say goodbye or pray for him. The two have suffered together in the camps for more than a year, and Elie has done everything he could to help and care for his father. But even so, his feelings now are mixed. Deep down, Elie fears he is relieved that his father is dead because he no longer has to worry about him or see him in pain. It is 1945 now, and that means that the war is nearly over. Within a few months, Elie should be free, but clearly he will never be the same. Let's start the last chapter of the book, page 107.
I had to stay at Buchenwald until April 11th. I have nothing to say of my life during this period. It no longer mattered. After my father's death, nothing could touch me anymore. I was transferred to the children's block where there were 600 of us. The front was drawing nearer. I spent my days in a state of total idleness, and I had but one desire: to eat. I no longer thought of my father or of my mother. From time to time I would dream of a drop of soup, of an extra ration of soup. On April 5th, the wheel of history turned. It was late in the afternoon. We were standing in the block waiting for an SS man to come and count us. He was late in coming. Such a delay was unknown till then in the history of Buchenwald. Something must have happened. 2 hours later, the loudspeaker sent out an order from the head of the camp. All the Jews must come to the assembly place. This was the end. Hitler was going to keep his promise. The children in our block went toward the place. There was nothing else we could do. Gustav, the head block, made this clear to us with his truncheon. But on the way we met some prisoners who whispered to us, "Go back to your block. The Germans are going to shoot you. Go back to your block and don't move." We went back to our block. We learned on the way that the camp resistance organization had decided not to abandon the Jews and was going to prevent their being liquidated. As it was late and there was great upheaval, innumerable Jews had passed themselves off as non-Jews. The head of the camp decided that a general roll call would take place the following day. Everybody would have to be present. The roll call took place. The head of the camp announced that Buchenwald was to be liquidated. 10 blocks of deportees would be evacuated each day. From this moment, there would be no further distribution of bread and soup, and the evacuation began. Every day, several thousand prisoners went through the camp gate and never came back.
Elie is alone in the world now, but he rarely thinks of his dead parents. In fact, he rarely thinks about anything but eating. He is beyond sadness and pain. The front, the main area of fighting in the war, is getting close to Buchenwald. The Allies are beating the Nazis. One day, the SS officers call all the prisoners to come to a meeting place. The officers' plan is to shoot the prisoners before the Allies come to set them free. But some of the prisoners have formed a resistance group, a group that plans to resist or fight back against the Nazis. The resistance leaders know about the plan, and they warn everyone else not to go to the meeting area. Still, the next day, the SS officers begin taking away prisoners in groups of several thousand and sending them to their deaths. We know that Elie will not be one of them, because we know he survived to write this book. But as we come to the end of the book, I wonder how he managed to survive. Let's finish the book. Continue on page 108 with, on April 10th.
On April 10th, there were still about 20,000 of us in the camp, including several hundred children. They decided to evacuate us all at once, right on until evening. Afterward, they were going to blow up the camp. So we were massed in the huge assembly square in rows of 5, waiting to see the gate open. Suddenly, the sirens began to wail. An alert! We went back to the blocks. It was too late to evacuate us that evening. The evacuation was postponed again to the following day. We were tormented with hunger. We had eaten nothing for 6 days, except a bit of grass or some potato peelings found near the kitchens. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the SS scattered through the camp, moving the last victims toward the assembly place. Then the resistance movement decided to act. Armed men suddenly rose up everywhere, bursts of firing, grenades exploding. We children stayed flat on the ground in the block. The battle did not last long. Toward noon, everything was quiet again. The SS had fled, and the resistance had taken charge of the running of the camp. At about 6 o'clock in the evening, the first American tank stood at the gates of Buchenwald. Our first act as free men was to throw ourselves onto the provisions. We thought only of that, not of revenge, not of our families, nothing but bread. And even when we were no longer hungry, there was still no one who thought of revenge. On the following day, some of the young men went to Weimar to get some potatoes and clothes and to sleep with girls, but of revenge, not a sign. 3 days after the liberation of Buchenwald, I became very ill with food poisoning. I was transferred to the hospital and spent 2 weeks between life and death. One day, I was able to get up after gathering all my strength. I wanted to see myself in the mirror hanging on the opposite wall. I had not seen myself since the ghetto. From the depths of the mirror, a corpse gazed back at me. The look in his eyes as they stared into mine has never left me.
Elie ends his story with the freeing of the prisoners of Buchenwald. Those who have survived, only a few hundred out of millions, are set free after the resistance group fights back against the SS officers and American soldiers finally arrive at the camp. The war is over, but think of the horrors that Elie has seen and lived through. Yet, somehow, he and the other prisoners do not want revenge. After the suffering and hunger they have been through, they can think only about their bodies. The first thing they do is eat. Other things will have to wait until later. We've come to the end of this book, and though it was difficult to read, it was also really important. The Holocaust really happened. 6 million Jews were murdered, along with gypsies, homosexuals, and anyone else the Nazis didn't like. We must never forget this. It's too late to save the victims of the Nazis, but it is not too late to make sure that such a hideous tragedy never happens again. As this book has shown, humans are capable of great evil, but they are also capable of doing good. This book is a message to the people who want to do good in the world. It is a warning to them not to stand by and do nothing while evil is inflicted on their fellow human beings. I hope you found Night as interesting and important as I did. Take care, and thank you for reading this book with me.